So, if that were the case, we would expect the child to also be fronting other sounds. So, for example, instead of cat, they may say tat, pulling that K sound back up to the front. Or instead of dog, we would hear dod, pulling that g sound up to the front. That would be a phonological processing error affecting multiple sounds, the error of fronting. Remember that developmentally, first children acquire a cognitive representation of sounds in their native language. Then they begin to develop the boundaries of each sound so that they know what makes it distinct from other sounds within their language. A phonological impairment, or again could be called a phonemic impairment, assumes that it's at that cognitive level that the breakdown occurs, either in the development of the representation itself or in the development of the boundaries that define that sound as unique. The most common symptom or sign of a phonological disorder is a limitation in intelligibility. So, again, as I said, kids with just simple articulation errors, their intelligibility is not greatly reduced. They make the same mistake all the time, it's predictable. We can understand what they're saying. Kids with phonological processing errors, because they are making errors on whole patterns, multiple sounds will be involved. And they're not as predictable. You know, if I were to take a survey around the class and ask how many of you have heard a person speaking that always leaves the last sound off of their words, probably not very many of you. But if I said how many of you have heard a person speaking who lisps, probably a lot more. It's a much more predictable issue. Speech sound disorders are present in between 4 and 13% of children. We're again going to talk about the United States in our literature about the United States. The incidence is much higher in males, and it is somewhat higher in immigrant populations and in Black American populations. It's probably in reality closer to 4% overall, but if we were to separate different populations of people, that prevalence goes up. 60% of children identified with speech sound disorders, we have no causation. We don't know why it's present for them. The other 40%, it is strongly associated with things like chronic middle ear infections in infancy and toddlerhood, or other developmental disorders or physical disorders where it comes along as part of the symptom mix of those disorders. So let's take a moment to consider, again, information about dialectical and linguistic diversity. Chapter 5 covers that. Again, I am not assigning you to read Chapter 5. I wish we had time in this semester to spend a lot of time in that chapter, but we don't. So just know that this is where this information is coming from. Increasingly, it is an issue of study because of the ease of worldwide immigration. So it's increasingly a problem in our school districts because of over-identification of children who do not have disorder. So over-identifying a child as having a speech sound disorder who truly doesn't. So for example, within the last 6 school years, I have had students on my caseload who've come from homes with primary languages of Spanish, Vietnamese, Khmer, Farsi, Urdu, Nepalese, and Arabic. I've also, if we look longer ago than that, or just look at the children I've assessed who did not end up on my caseload, I have also assessed children with Mandarin Chinese, Tagalog, and Russian. I also have had or have students on my caseload who speak just different dialects of English. So dialect is a speech language variation within a language. So African American English, Black English, Appalachian English, people with a Southern American dialect, a far northeastern dialect. My family happens to come from a northeastern region in Pennsylvania, and they speak a very particular dialect in that area. Students who exhibit only speech variations that can be attributed to dialect or to foreign accent, or are language influenced or culturally influenced, They don't belong on our caseloads unless that disorder is present within their primary language. So, for example, I had a student a few years ago named Anis, and when I got the referral for him, his teacher was like, "I'm having a hard time understanding him. He's, making some speech sound production errors." And I looked at his primary language was Spanish. Okay, so that's a language that I'm super familiar with assessing. So I, didn't think much of it. But I had our district interpreter call his parent to set up the assessment planning meeting that the interpreter would then come to. And she did that. And then she called me back and she said, I want to make you aware that Anis is from Guatemala. He's not from Mexico. And he speaks a very specific dialect of Spanish. And she was able to give me some information. And then I also did my due diligence and looked up more information on that, so that I didn't make that error of putting him on my caseload based simply on a difference in his production because of a different dialect I wasn't as familiar with. In a private practice setting, it's not uncommon for adults, now I'm not talking about kids necessarily, but for adults to be seen for accent reduction services. And that's completely fine. I did that myself. I worked for an agency, 29 years ago, where I was working with foreign born professionals who wanted to reduce their accent. We never ever try and eliminate accent. It's a very attractive quality. Americans love accents, but we're very impatient if we can't understand people. So it's not uncommon for foreign born professionals to want to reduce their accent a bit to make themselves be able to be understood. But we have to make it abundantly clear to them that this is not in any way necessary, and it is not remediation. It is not therapy. It is never to be billed to medical insurance. That is a real violation of ethics, because it is not a disorder. But we are eminently qualified to provide that kind of speech coaching to people. And that's fine in a private setting as long as all of those factors are considered. In the schools, we must assure that a speech disorder is present in the primary language before we have this kind of awesome responsibility we need to take very seriously of labeling a child as disabled in some way. So we're just going to go through a few definitions here, and then we will break this video. So the first one is the term phoneme. So let me apologize to those of you who have already taken phonetics or are currently taking phonetics. Some of this is certainly going to be review for you, but for some of you it's new information. So please hang on for the ride. Phoneme. A phoneme or phonemes are the meaningful sounds of a language. In standard American English, we have about 40 phonemes. And I do say about because if there is a dialect involved, then there may be an additional phoneme or two, or there may be some removed. A phoneme, what makes a sound a phoneme is that it is linguistically contrastive. What that means is that if we change the phoneme significantly enough within a word, it will change the meaning of a word. So, for example, if we compare the words bag and back, the only change I made in that was turning my voice off for the K and on for the G. Bag, back. But you heard two very different words because there were two very different phonemes at the end of each of those words. Also, words like meet and mit. The only change in that word was the vowel sound. Everything else was the same. But because I changed it, it was a change of phoneme. So it was linguistically contrastive. An allophone, A-L-L-O, phone, one word, allophone, is a variant within a phoneme. So these are non-linguistically significant or non-significant linguistically, let's put it that way. So for example, I'm going to have you sitting here on Zoom repeat some things after me now for the next few examples. And boy, this would be so much easier if we were with each other. But we're going to talk about the t phoneme. So T, letter T, and the sound it makes t. So the two words I want to contrast are how that sound is produced in the words tea and in the word mat. Now, it's a single phoneme. There's it's t, it's not the reason, the fact that it's two different words is not because there's a change in the phoneme, but it is an allophonic production of the t sound. So say those words and feel that they are said at slightly different places within the oral structure, very slightly, and they're released differently. It means as the phoneme is completed, you're releasing the sound a little differently. So T, mat. This represents an allophone. If we could look at production of those words on a computerized instrument, back when I was in your seats, it was called a Visipitch. I think there's a program now for that. That I'm not sure what it's called. But if we could look at that visual representation of the acoustics of the sound, you would see that it looks a significant enough difference. But again, the difference between t and t is not linguistically contrastive. It is non-significant, a non-significant variant. So, for example, if we do the words mat and mad, now we've made a phoneme difference. Even though we produce those two sounds in the same place in our mouth, one has voicing and one doesn't. So that's a phoneme change. T and mat, looking at the t sound, is an allophone. So I'm going to have you do another repeating after me experiment here, and this time we're going to focus on the ul, or the L, the ul phoneme. And I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words or phrases. I want you to repeat them after me. We'll do it twice. I want you to pay attention to how they sound, how the ul sounds. That's your sound you're targeting. And think about that tongue placement. So here they are. Listen, fall in, please, clue, fall down, and muddle. Now we're going to go through them again. Pay really close attention to where your tongue goes for that ul phoneme, okay? Listen, fall down, please, clue, fall in, muddle. Your tongue is going to slightly different places. Sometimes it's all the way up on your teeth, as in clue or please. It's very far forward and up on my teeth when I produce that sound. But when I say the words listen and muddle, it's pulled way back in my mouth. However, if I were listening, I would say it's all ul. It's all the phoneme ul. But those are allophonic distinctions. Doesn't change. They're non-significant linguistically, but they change the sound of that ul just a little bit. When we are assessing and treating sounds have to be looked at in isolation and in syllable production, or in other words, in the context of other sounds. So we want to see, can the person say ul or s or z or t? That's in isolation. But we also want to see if the person can say a ta, a te, e t, or just la, le, li. We want to see if it changes their ability to produce the sound by putting it at the beginning of a syllable, or at the end of a syllable, or in the middle of a syllable. Some of our kids may be able to hold on to that production in isolation. They can copy s, but the minute you say, okay, now say bus, they say buff. Their error is sort of tied into the language, perhaps, but it also may be that syllable construction that just throws it off. So we always have to test and treat in all contexts. Some kids may even be able to hold on to correct production for an entire word if they're repeating. So if a child's struggling with the L sound and I say umbrella, they can say umbrella. But then if I say, now let's put it in a sentence, I held the umbrella in the rain, I may get, I held the umbrella in the rain. They can't hold it within a sentence context. So we have to move when we're doing therapy and in testing. We have to look at all of those different contexts. Um, Coarticulation is the next definition that we're going to talk about, the next term. Sorry, I just messed up my notes on the computer here. Coarticulation is a descriptive term that we use to discuss how articulatory characteristics of phonemes or sounds vary by context. So we're still talking about allophones to an extent, but not as a pure definition of allophone. So again, I'm going to have you say some words. This time, the t phoneme is always going to be at the beginning of a word, but I want you to pay attention to how differently it feels in your mouth when you pronounce just the t, but we're going to put it in context. So your two words are to and t. Now, I can purposely say them exactly the same way, to, t. But in reality, I don't say them exactly the same way. To, t. I know it's hard to see on video, but when I produce two, my teeth are directly on top of each other, top teeth and bottom teeth. When I produce t, I tend to overlap my teeth a little bit because of that back e sound. The phoneme is still t, but there is a discrete difference in production that results in it being an allophone, correct? So a more extreme example of coarticulation would be the difference between still on this t phoneme, but when we throw an R into the mix. Now, some of you don't make this difference, but many of you do. So I'm going to show you the example of it. Were we sitting in class, I'd go around the room and have you say it, and I would let you know whether you do this or don't do it. But so the words are T and tree. Now, I made a big difference in my sounds. I don't normally do that. I normally say T and tree. But many people say T, tree. Can you hear the difference? I'm going to do it slowly and I'm going to make it really obvious. T, tree. The difference is the first one is definitely a t phoneme. In the word tree, that first sound is really the ch sound, tree. It's coarticulation. We have changed the phoneme between t and in t and t in tree, and we've done it because of that R. Another example would be the difference in production of s in the words sun and strawberry. Now, I don't say strawberry. I say strawberry, and I hope on the video you can hear the difference. Sun, strawberry. But many people say sun, strawberry with an SH sound at the beginning, and I'm sure many of you do that. It is not a disorder. It is a coarticulation variation in production of the sound that actually changes the phoneme production. And then the last definition we'll talk about is assimilation. And this is when one sound takes on the features of another sound in a word because of its close proximity. So, for example, we're going to talk about the sound ah, the vowel sound ah, okay? In the word cat, it's really a pure ah sound, cat. In the word man, it's a very nasal sound because of the nasal M and the nasal N. So listen again, and I'll do man, very nasal. Cat, there's no nasality in cat at all. But in man, that ah becomes a very nasal sound. This is assimilation. Sometimes we can use the term assimilation also to describe the phonological process of consonant harmony, if you look at the phonological processes. So again, back to that word lelo, you could say that the y at the beginning of yellow is taking on the features of that second L sound, lelo. It's kind of an iffy example, but it is sort of assimilation of the characteristics of the L to the front of the word. Okay, we're going to stop right there with this lecture, and now next time listen to part 2. Thanks.